Can you address, in a very broad sense, what international law is? What does it mean?
Well, international law is the concept that countries can enter into agreements with other countries or into alliances. They can be military alliances or human rights alliances or even economic alliances. So international law gives execution power to those types of agreements. For example, the United Nations Charter and its members have an international law component.
Are those the major purposes of international law?
Well, international law is, again, for a variety of reasons. It could be for war and peace issues. It could be for military alliances. So let's look at those two examples. The United Nations was created after World War II to provide a peaceful resolution of international conflicts. The League of Nations was an attempt of the same goal after World War I, but without the United States ratification during the Wilson administration, it was not as robust as it could have been. But after World War II, 50 countries came together initially to create the United Nations Charter. And that international organization is attached to international law as long as the member nations are consenting to a certain outcome.
Can you identify sort of grand or overarching ideas embedded in international law?
Absolutely. So one of the most important ideas is the avoidance of war. There have to be mechanisms for countries to peacefully discuss their differences and come to some kind of resolution. But military conflict may be inevitable. And for that, you might need military alliances. So an example is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, which is a collection of Western powers originally formulated as a mutual protection against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet equivalent of NATO. Even though the Soviet Union is dissolved, NATO still exists, and it is going to be an important part of the future of European security.
Can you address how international organizations help to maintain international order?
Sure. So international organizations can be human rights organizations, they can be environmental organizations, and they can be any non-governmental organizations that try to help implement international law. So there is an overlap between international organizations and international law.
Do you think American citizens can actually influence international relations, and if so, how?
That's a very interesting question. Americans can influence international relations by our engagement and participation in government decisions. So if we can bring these lessons together, it would be about the connection between civic engagement and government outcomes. If American citizens want to go to war or want to protest an international situation, civic engagement is the way to get that started. And we can think about ending war and pulling out of international arrangements in the same way. We can think about the Vietnam War ending under pressure of United States, especially from young students, demonstrating to discuss ways of getting out of that conflict. At the same time, when we have genocide or other humanitarian crises, sometimes the push is to get involved in another country's affairs. We can think about that right now with the Syria migration crisis and the Syrian civil war that has raged for 5 years. The question is, what can we do? And our political leaders have tried to take a pulse of American feeling, and frankly, it's not an issue in which the average American is terribly engaged. There are groups on both sides about getting involved or not. It's something to talk about at the highest political levels, but we don't see a lot of people on the street right now trying to get the United States to take a certain direction.
Can you summarize, just as we end this lesson, can you summarize what you think the effects of globalization have been? I think you defined it already, what globalization is, but what have been its, can you identify in general what its effects have been?
Well, one of the themes we've been talking about in this lesson is how do you get people interested in something that doesn't touch them directly? So even though the word globalization implies something very sophisticated, it can actually take place every time you go shopping at the store. So for example, what is the effect of globalization in imports? So if we used to have a vibrant manufacturing economy in this country and jobs go overseas, it seems like a net loss for American workers in the American economy. But every time you go to a big box shopping center and you buy a lot of cheap imported clothes, that's actually a benefit for your family. It's almost like getting a big tax decrease or a big income boost. In other words, does your dollar buy more with international goods because they are made much more cheaply than they can be made here? That's an example of globalization that touches everything you wear and a lot of the things that you buy every day. That's just one example.